Anyone who's ever tried to write a story before knows that the question of how to start your first chapter is one that has frustrated the writing community since the dawn of fiction writing. It's certainly frustrated me over the course of my writing career. How do I start a story in a way that will draw people in? How do I quickly sell people on my main character or concept in a way that will make people want to root for my character, or at least see what happens next? The internet is absolutely packed with advice on how to go about starting your story. Most of it, however, is concerned with written books instead of comic books, so the advice is only applicable to a certain degree. For example, one of the most common tips you'll encounter for writing your first chapter is that you need to hook your audience in from the very first sentence with something impactful, poetic, or mysterious. I know, that's a lot of pressure to put on the first few words, and my gripes with that could fill a whole other newsletter, but I'll spare you the diatribe for now. The problem is, we're in the comic world. There is no first sentence. There's a first line of dialogue or a first caption you'll encounter, but those won't necessarily be the first things a new reader sees. The story may open on an establishing shot of some location with no caption or dialogue to tell you where you are or establish the presence of any characters. The story might start on an action sequence with emphasis placed on sound effects and dynamic visuals over spoken words. In a medium where there isn't always a first sentence to get hooked on, how do comic writers draw readers in from the outset? That's what I'm looking at today. Last week, I wrote about how the final panel before a page flip plays a crucial role in getting the audience to turn to the next page. This is especially applicable for the first page. You need to make sure that whatever your final panel is on your first page entices readers to flip to the next one. You can check out my previous newsletter for a detailed breakdown of your options. However, that doesn't mean the rest of the page is irrelevant. Far from it. The first page is your opener. It introduces the audience to important characters, places, or concepts, provided you're doing it right. You can tell an entire story over the course of a single page, and knowing how to do that well will vastly increase your chances that a reader will want to see what's in store for the rest of Chapter 1. Based on my research, if you break down what's happening on the first page of any comic, you'll likely find at least one of several of the following points being done. The main character is introduced. The easiest and most obvious choice for a first page is to introduce the main character, or characters. This can be as simple as seeing them within their environment to as complex as a moment that quickly characterizes them or something important about them. Tons of stories choose not to show their main character for another page or so, however, so if you'd rather focus on some of the following methods instead, that's entirely valid. The setting is introduced. A very common first panel is an establishing shot of a location. This is especially true in fantasy stories to quickly convey to the audience that the story takes place in a fictional world. An establishing shot of an easy-to-recognize real-world place, like New York City or the Eiffel Tower, is also a viable option to quickly let the readers know that the story takes place in our world, or at least one very much like it, and grounds them in a known location. An establishing shot of a setting is generally also accompanied by a caption announcing the location or time period. But if a location is iconic enough that the time period isn't important to the story, this is easily skippable without losing out on the chance to explain some of your world. Optionally, you may open on an establishing shot paired with a caption or dialogue of the main character narrating. Often this is used to set the tone or establish the theme of the story, which is discussed in more detail below. The inciting incident occurs. The inciting incident is the thing that kicks off the events of the story. This could be something like the arrival of a magical being who is going to inevitably change the course of the main character's life. The unexpected death of a person begins a chain reaction that starts the events of the story. Or we get a glimpse of the story's antagonist just beginning to enact their evil plan that will become the focal point of the story. It's not uncommon for stories to start with a single page that shows the inciting incident. Then the following page transitions to somewhere else, usually wherever the main character is, as they go about their daily life, unaware of the inciting incident having just occurred or the impact it's about to have on their life. The theme of the story is spelled out. If your story has a particular theme or message you want to convey, you may choose to spell it out or hint at it on the first page. This is usually done when the writer wants to set the tone or keep an idea in the back of a reader's mind for the duration of the story. Then the final page of the story often repeats these themes, but now it comes with the extra context of the story the reader just witnessed. It's a clean way to bookend a story and give it a feeling of coming full circle. It's common for stories that spell out their theme at the start to do so through narration and captions or dialogue over top an establishing shot or some kind of mood piece to set the tone. Doing this simultaneously puts the audience in the right headspace for the story and gives context clues about the location or what sort of tone to expect. You get a lore dump. A lore dump is the term used to describe any scene that takes the time to explain a facet of the world the story takes place in. They usually explain the history of the world the story takes place in, how the magic system of the world works, or some other piece of information that would be known to the characters inhabiting the world, but would be unknown to a new reader. Usually, said lore is something that the audience needs to understand for the story to make sense. Opening lore dumps, like theme explanations, are often done over top establishing shots and mood pieces. Or, in the case of historical lore dumping, overtop imagery that paints a picture of the historical conflicts and important figures within the world's history. Just like the final panel options I laid out last week, this is not an exhaustive list of all the things that can happen on a first page, but I find it covers the vast majority of what you'll see. Some first pages manage to do several of these things in one go. Some focus on one. It really depends on how much the writer can or wants to show the audience right out the gate. After all, you don't want to show the audience too much if you're writing a mystery, but if you don't do any of these things, you may quickly lose the interest of a potential reader. With all of that established, I'm still left with a daunting question of, how do I want to start my story? In my original run of The Chosen One's Mentor, I opened the story with the lore. At the time, I thought the most important thing I could do was introduce readers to the driving concept of the world the characters live in, so that everything that followed made sense. However, now that I've been studying up on the various ways to open a story and how those choices can affect the overall tone, it became clear to me that I had a better option. TCOM, above all else, is a character-driven story. The presence of the magic, the prophecy, the lore on which the kingdom is built, this is all set dressing for a story about a man learning how to be a good role model for a child. The child being a ticking time bomb of magical mishaps is just something to make the story more unique and create problems that drive or influence various subplots along the way. Opening with the lore of the world was fine, but I'm not trying to tell a story about adventures in a magical land. I'm trying to tell a story about people and how unexpected events can develop into life-changing journeys of self-discovery. This means it's not the introduction of the lore that's important, it's Renan's introduction and the surrounding introductions of the rest of the main cast that is most important. I want the audience to latch onto Renan and his fellow castmates and feel compelled to see where their story goes. The existence of magic and the lore of the world, therefore, should always be secondary to the goal of writing character-driven stories. With that new focus in mind, I started narrowing down my options. Of the various listed ways I could open a story on, what sounded the most appealing? I had already nixed the idea of opening on a lore dump, I wasn't interested in opening on a page about the themes, and opening on the inciting incident would rob me of the chance to show off the characters pre-panicking at the sight of a fire-breathing baby. That left me with character introductions and establishing shots. Having an establishing shot is an easy sell. I'm writing within a fantasy world after all. It would be in my best interest to establish that out the gate. So I made a note that the first page would feature an establishing shot. But one establishing shot does not make for a particularly compelling opener. At least not without adding some extra spice like it being a stormy day or throwing dialogue over top. So this would only be one part of my page. That leaves me with character introductions, which, considering my whole spiel I just wrote about this being a character-driven story, is a no-brainer of a choice. But who should I introduce? Did I want Renan to be the very first character the audience sees? Would I be able to write a scene that makes Renan an intriguing enough person to follow from the get-go? As near and dear as Renan is to my heart, I wasn't so sure focusing on him right out the gate was my best bet. Plus, when I consider that the inciting incident of the story is the birth of the Chosen One, it became clear that someone else would be a lot more interesting to focus on right now. Someone who currently has far more at stake in the opening of the story. Nolan, the King of Ithiel and about-to-be first-time father. If anyone would be having a moment worth looking in on at the top of the story, it's him. Today is the day the Chosen One will be born. That's important for the kingdom, undeniably. Anything important to the kingdom is important to the king who rules over it. But he has a personal stake in this story. The Chosen One isn't just some future savior of the kingdom. The Chosen One is his child, his first child. Heir to the throne and savior of the kingdom be damned, Nolan is about to be a father, and he's freaking out. With my opening focus decided on, I got started. Panel 1. It's a snowy day over the capital city in the Kingdom of Ithiel. New Year's Day, to be more specific, as the captions will establish. This is a story-relevant point to make, so I'm going to make it. The next panel zooms in on the palace, which was visible in the first panel. Someone, the audience doesn't know who, is crying out in pain. Panel 3 introduces Nolan. We get a nice, clear shot of him as he paces the hallway outside the room where those screams of pain are coming from. He looks anxious. Dialogue filters through the door amidst the cries of pain that contextualize what is happening. A woman is giving birth. Between the anxious pacing, the knowledge that someone is trying to have a baby, the dialogue referring to that someone as Your Majesty, the fact that the establishing shot opened on a kingdom and zoomed in on the palace, and the man's visible circlet and cape combo, the audience should be capable of piecing together with these 3 panels that the man pictured is the king of Ithiel, the woman inside is the queen, and their child is about to be born. Regardless of the setting, any parent can empathize with the anxiety that comes during the minutes to hours before your child is born, especially if your wife sounds like she's having a very bad time in there. My hope is that in choosing these first few panels, the audience instantly has at least some degree of empathy for Nolan or the queen. They're just 2 people having very realistic reactions to the coming birth of a child. Nolan's characterization continues on the next 2 panels. He pauses outside the door as the queen lets out a big scream of pain. He's clearly worried. What good husband wouldn't be worried at the sound of their wife screaming in pain? He stares at the door handle, clearly thinking about going in. He wants to be of help, even if he doesn't know how he can help. He reaches for the door handle, but he's stopped by the words, "I wouldn't go in there if I were you." This is the last panel of the page. A mystery has been established. Who is speaking? Where are they? Why are they advising against a husband going in to support his wife through childbirth? Nolan's hand pauses before it reaches the handle, which, if you're thinking even harder about that moment, should also be interesting. Why is a king listening to what someone else has to say? These are all questions that will be answered, at least in part, by the coming pages. Which, in going with the big reveal on a page flip angle I've discussed previously, when the audience does flip the page to see who's talking, this will be their first full-body introduction to Renan. I think going with this opening makes the most sense. Nolan's the one who's more emotionally invested in the current situation. The audience can latch on to those clear emotions to begin to feel something for him. Renan, in contrast, is not as emotionally invested in the birth of the Chosen One, so starting with him would be less impactful. However, he does care about Nolan, so he's there to support him, and the following scene between them will emphasize that. The audience will go on to learn about Renan through his interactions with Nolan and the way he speaks about other people. Then, when the Chosen One is born and things start getting chaotic, Renan will be the one who leaps into action to control the situation. The first page isn't about him, but every page that follows will be. So by the time the chapter wraps up, the audience is sold on him as the main character and wants to see more of him. At least, that's what I sure hope happens when all is said and done. Okay, I warped the timeline a little on when I said I figured out how I wanted page 1 to look. Anyone who's been around since issue number 3 may recognize that what I just described is what I drew over a month ago. But that's okay. If anything, I'm glad to know that my initial rewrite was already following the rules I established over the last 2 weeks before I knew how to put them into words. However, I will add the stipulation that for as much as I nailed the first 1.5 weeks ago, the scene following it is going to undergo some changes. I'm no longer as happy as I was with the conversation Renan and Nolan have following the introduction. It's not bad, it just needs tweaking to accomplish my goal of simultaneously introducing the audience to the characters while seamlessly sprinkling in some lore in a way that won't feel forced. Perfecting their conversation is going to be a focus of mine coming up, and maybe I'll talk about that in depth a little later. We'll see. In any case, I'm already hitting my self-imposed page limit on this newsletter, so let's pivot to talk about painting and wrap things up. For week 2 of my round brushes study, I wanted to tackle 2 of the most common uses I saw for round brushes in greater depth: line work and stippling. For those of you who don't know what stippling is, it's basically just a fancy way to say making lots and lots of dots. It is the most tedious way to shade, though when done well, it looks amazing. In painting, it's a popular method for blocking in things like leaves and small rocks because you can easily build up layers of colors with this method to get some really nice textured results. That's what I wanted this week. I wanted texture. I wanted to see how much I could accomplish using just these 2 methods of using a round brush. And you know what? It didn't turn out half bad. I definitely spent a lot more time on this one than I have most of my other paintings. I found it so easy to sink into a rhythm of making a million small dots or layering different colored paints on top of each other to varying effect. The entirety of my midday melted away as I worked on this one, and I barely even noticed till it was suddenly time for dinner. I think for the first time, I managed to make some pretty nice and organic looking gradients by stippling and playing around with how wet the brush was. My technique still needs some refinement, but it worked for the most part. I'd say the biggest problem I wound up having was down to user error. The finished product this week is very bright, kind of warm and charming. But when I originally pictured this shot in my head, I had wanted it to be dark and misty. So how did it end up like this instead? Well, because I don't know how to mix colors. Or more accurately, I don't know how to get to the colors in my head with my limited color mixing experience. The nice thing about being a digital artist is you have all the colors available all the time, and altering them is as easy as a few clicks. That's not the case with paint though. You have to understand color theory to create the exact colors you want. And while I was often able to get myself in the right direction, I was never quite able to nail the color I really wanted before I realized how bright and sunny the scene was looking. So I pivoted, and I leaned into that bright feel. But I even goofed that up. Try as I might, I couldn't get the highlight colors I really wanted, which I know would have made the painting pop more. Instead, I mostly ended up with shades that were too dark that muddied what I'd already done. Next week, I'll start on another brush type, but I'll also start making it a habit to learn a little more about color mixing. Once I have a better understanding of my brushes and how to create the colors I want, I think I'll be able to create some truly excellent pieces going forward. And that's all for this week, gang. Thanks for listening.